Welcome to the Arizona Wildland Urban Interface Summit. I am Molly McCormick. I am the program manager of the Southwest Fire Science Consortium, and we helped, along with others, put on this event for you. One of the things that we wanted to say in this welcoming is that this is not the first time Arizona's had a Wildland Urban Interface Summit. We did this years ago, and then it kind of dwindled out, and we realized that fire in the wildland urban interface is a growing concern across the state. So one of the things that you can help us with this year is to figure out how we're going to keep this going. We also want to know what kind of topics we can address at future summits, and there'll be opportunities for you to weigh in various ways on and share your perspectives and your needs as the summit goes on. And so, I want to just say, first we're on the lands of the Tohono O'odham and Yaqui people, and in Arizona we work on the lands of 22 federally recognized tribes. This year at the summit we have 175 attendees, and we were able to offer, let me just double check so I don't get it wrong, $9,600 in scholarships to get people here, so round of applause for that. With that, I want to say, who was it that was responsible for this convening? So I already mentioned the Southwest Fire Science Consortium. Also, funding from the state that went to the NAU School of Forestry, and that funding was called Arizona Wildfire Initiative. So they also a big player here. And also Forest Stewards Guild. So a round of applause for those organizations. And our sponsors are Salt River Project, Fireside, and the International Association for Wildland Fire. So thank you all for helping to make this happen. The Southwest Fire Science Consortium is funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. In addition to meetings and workshops like this, we have synthesis of science on various topics. We do fact sheets, we convene field trips. Some of those items you can see on the slide behind me and get more information. We have a table out front. I encourage you to stop by and just explore what kinds of support we can offer you. One cool thing that is actually an eyeglass holder. So if you take it apart, it becomes an eyeglass holder you can use in the field or in your office if you need reading glasses. So you're welcome. What else do I need to tell you before we get going? So hopefully you found the restrooms outside. We're gonna have snacks, water, coffee, tea happening all the whole time. Each break we'll have snacks. Lunch is provided all 3 days. Tomorrow we're gonna go on a field trip, so we'll have sack lunch. And you'll have a sack lunch regardless if you can go on a field trip or not. Tonight we're gonna have a social event with appetizers, so hopefully you all will be able to stay for that. And before I welcome up our plenary speakers, I just want to acknowledge all of the individuals that helped put this agenda together and make this conference happen. So if you are on the planning committee, can you please stand up? So thank you for investing your time and energy and showing us that this really is an important event. And we also appreciate all your time here. And also, big shout out to my colleague, Megan Rangel-Lynch, who is really the person responsible for all this. So stand up, Megan, and kudos to you. And you're gonna hear more from Megan later on in the conference. So first, I want to welcome up Nicole Gillet, who's going to welcome us to this space from the city of Tucson.
All right, I'm not really a podium person, so, if I start wandering too far and you can't hear me, someone do hand signals at me, so I... Should I walk? Should I wander and walk? Ooh, now I have to hold this, though. I don't know. It's a lot of responsibility. So, good morning, everyone. Again, my name's Nicole. I was sort of tasked with doing some place setting for all of us, welcoming you all to our beautiful city. So that's what I'm going to do. I am not a fire person, so I'm not even going to attempt to wander into that territory. So you're now my captive audience for something entirely different for the next 20 minutes. So first, just want to welcome you all to Tucson, to Pima County, to the Santa Cruz River Valley. And I want to take a moment just to pause on this slide because we're in a really special place. And I hope if you're not all that familiar with Tucson, you get a chance to get outside and enjoy this slice of the Sonoran Desert. It's a place that I love, and I love getting to work in. And it's very special forestry-wise, as I don't think I need to tell anyone here. I was actually just in Chicago, and I asked the room, wow, who's been to Tucson and thinks, wow, what a beautiful forest? No one raised their hand. So it's great to be back in a room of people who appreciate where we are and what a special environment we all get to work in. Never take it for granted. It's something really unique. I think you all know it's actually the Sonoran Desert is the most biodiverse desert in the world. And there are some who would argue we're not even a real desert because of the enormous amount of rainfall that we get here, so much. But it creates a very unique ecosystem. And then you add in sort of the effect of us being right along the Sky Island Ridge. We get the convergence of the mountains and the desert to create this really special place that is an excellent place to get to work and definitely a place worth protecting for all of us. So that's sort of my welcome to the desert, and you all do really important work, and I appreciate all the work you do protecting these ecosystems. I mostly get to work in the city, and so have a deep appreciation for everyone who gets to sort of work on our margins and out into the desert. On this slide, I just wanted to point out one of our iconic desert species, the ironwood tree. Maybe you could call her the mother of the desert, right? And what do we sort of notice about this tree? I'm not actually going to call on anyone, but I'll plant a seed here that the ironwood tree is never alone, right? She exists out in our desert to nurture all the other species of the desert. So we can see in this excellent photo, that is not my photo, I'm not this good of a photographer, but you can see all the other species that are sort of sheltering under the ironwood, right? It's known especially for being the sort of birthplace of our saguaros. They will grow up underneath our ironwoods, seek shelter, and also share resources together. Of course, it's not just the saguaros as well. We see many other species of cactus, as well as mid and understory plants. But also, of course, you could picture a coyote rutting under here, right? Our ground squirrels making nests under here, and people seeking shelter in the desert shade for over 12,000 years here in the desert, right? So not only is it our most biodiverse desert in the world, it's also the longest continuously inhabited place in North America, largely due to this biodiversity that people are an essential part of, right? Not only do we live here, but we influence our environments. We are a piece of this biodiversity, and as such, this is sort of my grounding for all of my work, right? How can we be a part of a functioning, healthy ecosystem that is resilient to change? And we all know this, a healthy, functioning ecosystem that has all the resources it needs to share is gonna be resilient to things like climate change, like drought. I'm not gonna even mention fire. Someone else will talk about that later. But so this is just a welcome and an invitation. Again, this is you all, I know many people here, but to many of our new faces, an invitation for us to work together, to remember that we're not alone. We don't do this work, we don't tackle these really sometimes overwhelming challenges alone. We exist in an ecosystem, and the stronger that ecosystem is, the more resilient we will all be to change as well. let's see, we have to point like really far in the back. Okay, so we go from the desert, we move into Tucson, the city, and I want to just invite myself and everyone else here as we move through all these topics to remember, where we're coming from and how can we implement these lessons we learned from the desert into our modern city, into our modern practices. Sometimes we move a little too fast for Ironwoods to keep up. And is there ever a moment to pause, reflect, and think on the lessons that we've learned, both from the people and our environments, and how can we incorporate that resilience into our modern day-to-day practices? Okay, urban forestry. Again, I'm the urban forestry manager for the city of Tucson. It's a pretty new role. I've been in this position for 4 years, and the program has existed for 4 years. So I'm also now a very excited team of 2 people, but one person is specialized in our grant programming. So I'm kind of a team of 1. But I'm certainly not the only person, nor the first, nor even the most important person who works on this work throughout the city. I pull on a huge team of experts, many of whom are sitting here in this room to get this work done. But very straightforward, our mission is what it says on the screen. It is to grow tree-based climate resilience. It is to help make our city a more livable place well into the future. You don't plant a tree, with the idea that it's going to grow and provide all of our amazing benefits next year. We're really looking, 5, 15, 50 years down the road at growing a city that can support all of the biodiversity that was here and all that will be here in the future. I'm going to go into more detail on sort of how this works within the city, because I know not everyone here is super familiar with sort of how governments and especially local governments work. But my role, is pretty straightforward. I work across the entire city on all things that touch trees in some way, which when I came into this job, I was like, oh, that'll be like, I don't know, a handful of people. No, it's a lot of people that touch trees in some way, which is amazing, and I get to work with an amazing group of folks. Okay. So 4 years ago, 2020, I think we can all vaguely remember where we were in 2020, our wonderful mayor took office and kicked off Tucson Million Trees. And if you're not familiar with Tucson Million Trees, it's kind of self-explanatory. We're aiming to plant 1 million trees in Tucson. Now within the next 5 years, because I'm about 4.5 years in, and this was really sort of her inaugural climate change promise, right? We are going to make Tucson a greener, cooler place to live for all Tucsonans. That was the initiation of my program, so I tackle both what I call, some people laugh at this, our short-term planting goal of 1 million trees, right? This is our short-term goal. We need to get trees in the ground. But again, I'm thinking even further than that. How do you build a environment which can take care of 1 million trees, right? So we plant 1 million trees. How do we get those trees to maturity? How do we get them to a point where they're living well beyond all of our lifespans and providing all those benefits indefinitely into the future? I just want to pause here because this is like one of those big thank you moments where you can never take for granted having a powerful team that actually has your back in the city. I've worked in many positions where leadership does not have your back, right? So I will never take this for granted. The leadership from our mayor and also just across the city has really allowed us to move at what I would consider to be a very fast pace to get a new program off the ground and kick off a lot of these initiatives. So it's just amazing. Okay, I don't think I need to spend a lot of time here. This is a room full of tree people, but why trees, right? Why urban forestry? Why was this something that was prioritized within the city? And I'm gonna just focus on sort of 3 messages because I get to speak to a huge range of audiences, right? I speak to members of the public, residences, HOAs. I speak to folks within the city who are filling our potholes, who are out there on the day-to-day. I also speak to a lot of policy and higher level folks who are making, big long-range decisions. So everyone has a different perspective and you kind of need to come at it with a different lens each time to help get that lesson hammered home, no matter who you're speaking to. So first is something that I've already mentioned, this idea that trees are part of a functioning ecosystem, and within a city you have an urban ecosystem, right? It might look different than that beautiful ironwood tree that we saw. Our systems are not always connected, we don't have all the same processes in place, but it's still an ecosystem, and it's worth investing in and making sure that it is as resilient to change as possible. So diversity is the backbone of any piece of resilience, and that's what I'm aiming to bring in through planting more trees, through growing out our species palette. So that message works for a certain audience, right? And then with some other folks, I'd like to point out that trees, plants, our landscape are a piece of infrastructure, right? So the same way that we put in pipes, we put in roads, we put in light poles, trees are a piece of our city's infrastructure that we invest in. And so that investment means not just the planting, it means the irrigation that goes in, it means the care, the maintenance. If that tree doesn't make it to maturity, all of that was for naught, right? All of our benefits, all of our investment grows with time, with planting trees, and that's the only piece of infrastructure we can say that about, right? So if you plant a tree, if you take care of it and you invest in it, it will grow in value over time, whereas that road is going downhill day one you put it in. I'm just kidding. And so the last piece is, of course, all of these wonderful benefits, right? So trees give us so much more than they take, right? We put in certain inputs, and then they give us this huge range of benefits that I could never fit onto a slide here, right? They filter our air pollution, they buffer sound, they capture carbon, they capture water. All of these things, we could go on and on about that. That could be an entire presentation. Point blank, I'm a tree person, trees are amazing, right? You pluck an ironwood out of the desert, you plop it into the city. Being a tree in the city is really hard, right? It's a hard job that we've tasked with it. We've confined their soil space. We've said, oh, you can't actually grow to 80 feet, that will hit the power line, all of these things. So being a tree is hard. And as such, trees get blamed for all kinds of things. And I'm not gonna debate on what actually cracked the sidewalk here, though I could. But we keep going. Like, wow, thank goodness we planted that tree. It looks so good. Okay, being a tree is hard, and they get blamed for a lot of things. The practical impact of that is that trees are a risk as well in our urban environment, right? So I can talk all day about how great trees are. I also have to deal with this reality, and I know a lot of you guys deal with this as well. Trees are a risk, and we have to also manage that risk. My goal is to plant trees with, the best possible space, give it the best possible chance to be the best possible neighbor it can be to all of our other residents, people, wildlife, the rest of our plants included. So, ideally we're all this beautiful mesquite in the middle of the park that has endless soil. I get that this is not always the case and not always possible, but that is sort of the underlying, we're trying to make trees be good neighbors. Right. Okay, this is by far the worst slide I'm gonna show you, but just in case you're not super familiar with how municipal governments are laid out, I know we come from a wide variety of agencies and backgrounds here. So I work for the city of Tucson, which is not Pima County, which is not a lot of other things. So we're functioning a little bit differently. So just a quick overview. We have a mayor and council and city manager based system. I work in the city manager's office on the climate action team, which I'll get to in a little bit on what that actually means. So the city manager reports to mayor and council reports to the residents, so that's great. Being sort of centered in the city manager's office means that I get to work with every department basically across the city. I convene an internal team, we call ourselves the tree team, I know it's really creative. And that pulls on all of our service departments that might touch trees in some way, so Parks and Rec, transportation, the usual suspects here. But then I also get to work with a lot of other folks that I think a lot of people might not think of initially. I work with planning and development services a lot on really fun things like code, woohoo. Work with IT because we're launching our first tree inventory, and so that's gonna require a lot of GIS input. And then, of course, maybe the most relevant to this, folks, is I get to work with police, fire, and our homeless protocol a lot. And would I have said that that was going to be a large portion of my job when I took this on? I had no idea, right? So anything from really dramatic illegal tree removals to wash clearance to training on staff, right? I get to interface with basically every department you can think of in the city, and then of course also our contractors, folks that are doing a lot of our landscape maintenance work, and then a huge range of community partners, which is maybe my favorite part of the job, right? Getting out to actually work with folks out in the field, get trees planted into the ground, take care of them, all that fun field-based work. So moving on from this eyesore of a slide. What have I been doing for the past 4 years? How are we doing all of this stuff? So the last 4 years, I'll admit, have not been the most exciting of the future planting efforts. When you're putting together a new program, you got to do a lot of the not sexy stuff, right? Like make a plan and find funding and all these things to get it done. Just as a very quick side note, Tucson Million Trees has no dedicated city funding. That is all funded by private donations. My program has no dedicated funding. It's my salary and then what I can scrape from all the other departments to help get stuff done. On the one hand, of course, that's slightly annoying not have any money, but it also sort of forces collaboration. And so through collaboration, we've gotten a lot of this stuff done. So we pulled together a stakeholder working group, and in this whole process, creating our very first community forest action plan funded by DFFM, who I know is half the room, so thanks guys, really appreciate it. That set forth, we called it an action plan for a reason. It is really guiding my immediate next steps and then looking into the short term, but also it assigns roles to community partners, residents, folks out there, not just me. So it is a comprehensive urban forestry approach for the entire city. And then in there are references to really exciting things like our species recommendation list, our policies and standards, things that you would expect out of a program that sort of guide best practices for urban forestry citywide. And it kicked off a lot of things like I mentioned before, our first tree inventory, which is a huge data gathering initiative, and a code review. Very exciting. Again, cannot do things alone, right? We've made a lot of progress in these 4 years, despite a lot of it being that behind the scenes work. And this is really another thank you slide. Again, I'm one person. I did not do all of this. I did very little of this, right? This is thanks to volunteers, to our community partners, to folks getting out there and actually getting the work done. There are other city programs working on this as well. It's not just me. And yeah, we're planting all these baby seeds, getting ready. And again, nothing happens in a vacuum. As much as we would like to just work on our one thing every day, right? That's not how you actually make progress, and that's not how you reach people either. So I always knew coming into this that we would need an underlying why message, right? Some people love trees. That's great. I love trees. A lot of people love trees. But to really get people excited about it, to really get sort of the motivation to get us going and make really fast progress, you need a why. I'm sure everyone here knows that. So we've always housed urban forestry within climate action, right? Planting trees is a climate solution that feels very tangible to a lot of people. Of course, it's only one piece of literally 164 actions or something that we've said that we're doing as part of climate action for the city, but it's one that feels very physical and very real to people. And so getting folks involved and housing this in this bigger picture initiative has been very helpful in both making progress, but also keeping the momentum and getting folks excited and stay excited and engaged throughout these past years. And then, how are we actually doing this work? So, again, planting trees is sort of the exciting, visible piece, right? I don't have any funding. We also have different needs around the city. So how do you prioritize what you're doing? We utilize the tree equity score. It's our guiding principle. It underlies all of our work that we are trying to get canopy into our communities that need it the most, where we can have the greatest impact. And they are our priority, right? righting historic wrongs, working towards environmental justice. This is one mechanism to do that. The tree equity score is used nationwide and also used in different departments throughout our city to prioritize these environmental efforts that are going to help grow a more resilient and cooler Tucson. And the one thing I'll point out here is I think some people are like, well, why use this? And what is the meaning behind it? The vast majority of our residents in Tucson live in a high priority neighborhood. So that's why, right? It's reaching our, the widest possible audience. Okay. So that was sort of my soapbox, and the rest of this is gonna go pretty fast. I'm gonna give you an overview of our actual program. I approach this as all of us here, right, have intersecting issues, and we can have multifaceted solutions. One of them can be urban forestry. We face flooding, we face dusty, pollutant-filled roads, we face drought, we face invasive species. A lot of these are gonna be covered by other experts here in the room that I already work with closely, and I hope that we all can continue to work together. Come talk to me, let's build a stronger network together, and work towards a resilient Tucson. Okay, so I'm like, the doom and gloom stuff that we all work towards. Maybe some folks were wondering why I was speaking here in the first place. Again, I think this is the why. If we all move together to tackle these things, we will grow stronger solutions, right? We won't feel as alone, we won't feel as isolated, and we won't feel as though some of these are truly insurmountable. We can come at it with different perspectives and work towards what might be ideas that we wouldn't otherwise have thought of on our own. Trees now more than ever, it's one of my slogans, right? Again, I've called on folks in the room here to help with each one of these projects, and it's gonna look different everywhere in the city. So it's gonna look different neighborhood by neighborhood. It's gonna look different in the urban core versus the margins. There are gonna be solutions that fit somewhere that don't fit elsewhere. So that, again, is where diversity is our strength, and moving forward together is gonna mean that each one of these is a successful urban forestry project. Okay, this is gonna be the whirlwind. I just wanted to show you what our plan actually looks like. We created this to be a sort of multi-tool approach. So this is a report, which is why there's gonna be so many words on the screen in a second. It's also a presentation, and so folks can take a piece of this, whatever is the most relevant, and present it to their audiences. So take what you need, ignore what you don't. It's meant to be multi-purpose. And I would invite you all here, where do you see yourself in this? And then maybe more importantly for me, where do you not see yourself in this? And those are the points that I think if you could come talk to me and we can build that new connection, we can add that in, right? We can build a better program that meets multiple needs. Okay, this is gonna go super fast because I think I have like 2 minutes. So these are all of the sections that are in here currently. We're already due for an update. I don't know how that so fast. Of course, we ground this all in why is our urban forestry program important? What values do we put into that? We've all seen trees that maybe were not planted, maintained according to my brand new standards. We've seen the sad trees around town. This is aiming to make guidance that is accessible to anyone so that you can plant a tree anywhere in the city and give it the best possible chance of survival. This is all online. You can download it, you can read it if you would so like. There are even like appendices and fun stuff like that. Okay, so you can see it might be a little bit text heavy for a presentation, but it's meant to be multi-purpose. So you can use different pieces of this, and then there are actual like flyers and smaller things that you can download to sort of do the quick message. I'm gonna end on our exciting next step. I don't think I did that. I claim no responsibility. Okay. Is that we received a $5 million grant from the USDA Forest Service. This is our next phase. This is gonna kick us off into the next 5 years of Grow Tucson. This is a neighborhood scale planting approach where we're growing not just trees, but the next tree stewards as well. And I like to say Tucson is a city of 500,000 people. Just think if everyone planted 2 trees over the next 5 years, or in the last 5 years, we would reach Tucson million trees together, right? And each one of those trees would have someone who actually cared about it. So that's where I'll end. This is my contact info. I think it'll come back up. And a huge thank you. I think that's in there, safe.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for that great introduction to the city of Tucson and welcoming us into the urban environment and some of the issues and solutions that the city's developing. So next, I am happy to introduce Neil Chapman. He is the Wildland Fire Captain with the city of Flagstaff. He's going to talk to us about the unique collaboration happening there and a little bit more perspective from his time on the Wildland Fire Council. Thanks, Neil.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here and for the intro. Appreciate that. Neil Chapman, Wildland Fire Captain with the city of Flagstaff. We have a 9-person team within our fire department, so pretty unique with a good amount of horsepower behind our program. So I'm going to talk today briefly about some challenges, hopefully end on a positive note about the opportunities we have and the traction we have in the state of Arizona to do some good things. Oh, okay, so lots of investments over the last 20 years, even longer, in reducing wildfire risk in the natural environment. This is a picture of a spot called Walker Lake, just north of Flagstaff. And we've been using this picture for years to talk about the changes we see in our forest and the things that we want to do to restore that fire-adapted condition. So here's the same spot, 100 years apart. Everybody in the room knows this story of this change that we're seeing out there. Well, one of the realities is that we're seeing hundreds of millions of dollars from the top down, from the feds and other partners coming into this environment to change that fuel condition back to something fire adapted. We can often think of the National Wildfire Cohesive Strategy around three parts of that: restoring and maintaining landscapes, fire adapted communities, and response to fire. This picture is a great example of our efforts to restore and maintain that landscape. So we are going back into these spots at a big scale all over our state and restoring that natural fire adapted condition. We have policy, we have social license, we have huge support for the timber industry that is trying to do this work. We have none of that at that scale for the work that we need to do in our communities. So this is the challenge. How do we take this national effort at reducing our wildfire risk in the forest, in our grasslands, in our woodlands, and turn that same amount of horsepower and traction into the built environment? So looking at this picture, this is inside city limits in Flagstaff. Where's the uncontrollable wildfire risk? We've basically reduced that risk in the open space there. That's City of Flagstaff open space, Observatory Mesa natural area. It's been thinned. We've got fire back in there. We're doing great work. Where's that risk? It's where all those roofs are. That's not what we want. And again, we've got the ability to do that restoration work in that open space. We're struggling to get that same work done in the built environment. Here's another one. There's the Coconino National Forest along Highway 180 there, just north of town. That's what the forest is supposed to look like. That was a really cool restoration project. That's a 4-fry prescription, the most modern NEPA that we've got in the area. Where is that uncontrollable wildfire risk? It's in the neighborhood. And I don't want to say that we've removed the wildfire risk from that forest. We've changed it. So we went from a catastrophic crown fire raging through the forest into the community to potentially a fast-moving grass fire from that forest into the community. And so if we can get that community aligned and looking at that fire-adapted strategy, the home hardening, the defensive space, working on our response strategies, we can mitigate that fast-moving grass fire really effectively. We're not going to do a whole lot about the raging crown fire. You stand back and take pictures. If it's that fast-moving grass fire, we know the science, we know the data, we know the real slides in our head. We can mitigate that risk to that neighborhood right there if we have those strategies in place. So action that's needed. This QR code takes you to a website. that's managed by the Alliance for Wildfire Resilience. And so this is staff that came out of the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission that have this really great tracking document with national policy that are aligned with those recommendations. And so the Wildfire Commission was formed in 2022 by the Biden administration. We had 50 people on that commission working together to develop recommendations for reducing wildfire risk. And I want to just go over a couple of those. I highly encourage you guys download and read that report. It's a little heavy. It's about 148 recommendations, 300 pages, but it's very digestible. There's lots of pictures and maps, and you know, it's not as scary when you download it and get into it. So please, if you haven't read that document yet, get in there. And so this QR code and that Google Doc that's live and it's updated frequently is aligned with those recommendations and tells you what national policy efforts are connecting to those exact recommendations. And the amazing story is over 50% of the recommendations have alignment with some sort of current policy action, not just something that's sitting in a committee, but actual bills that are moving forwards. And so in that national space, the very first recommendation we put in this report identifies what we're talking about today, this Wildland Urban Interface Challenge. And so the number one recommendation coming out of that report, Congress should establish a community wildfire risk reduction program via an interagency coordinating partnership, including U.S. Forest Service, Federal Emergency Management Agency, United States Fire Administration, Office of Wildland Fire on behalf of the Department of Interior's land management agencies, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology as principal agencies to proactively address wildfire risk reduction actions and increase ignition resistance of the built environment. So that's a lot of words there, but in reality, we have all these national top-down collaborative groups that are dealing with trying to fix the fuel issues in the natural environment. We don't have one that's formed with that original intent of going into our neighborhoods, going into driveways, going into your backyards, and working on that sort of program. And so this Fire Environment Center, or whatever different terms people are using through different policy actions, this is where we need to start. This is the biggest change we can make, I think, at that national level, is organize around that intention. And then the second recommendation I want to mention here real quick, especially with the audience we have in this room of people in the fire service, U.S. Fire Administration. It's housed under FEMA. Not a lot of people know what goes on there, other than they give us SAFER grants, they give us AFG grants. But we have a recommendation in there, number 56. Congress should increase support for the U.S. Fire Administration to provide expanded community-based wildfire training and engagement of the nation's non-federal fire service, promote fire-adapted communities to build community resilience, and improve coordination with wildland fire management as a critical and necessary partner in wildfire risk reduction. U.S. Fire Administration has some wonderful people that work for them. There's about 5 on their wildland team. 5, okay? We need 50, we need 500. We need a lot more of that effort. When you download the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunities for AFG grants, the word wildland fire is not in there if you search for it. But we are eligible to apply for funding for wildland fire equipment and supplies in that grant. And so we recently said, can you at least put that word in there somewhere so we know, so we can make it a lot more clear. And so we have this strong tradition of national fire service organizations that are largely still focused on EMS and structure fire response. We need equal horsepower, again, in this wildland urban interface space, and giving that capacity, that training, and really thinking about who are our people responding to these issues at a national level. In the Wildfire Commission space, we did some analysis about workforce. Who are the people responding to wildfires? And it was pretty amazing. You know, we often out in this area, we think of the green trucks, we think of the Forest Service, and they do amazing work. They are an incredible part of a comprehensive wildfire risk reduction workforce for areas like Flagstaff, for areas like Tucson. But when we look at this nationally, we see about 20 to 25,000 Forest Service wildland firefighters. We didn't have good numbers on state and county fire departments, because sometimes we weren't sure if that's including cooperators and contractors, or if it was just them alone, but we're seeing at least like 8,000 in CAL FIRE alone. So let's say nationally 20, 25,000, again, equal to the federal workforce. NGOs play a great role in this. They may not have giant numbers, but they play an outsized role in advocacy and support for a lot of things like prescribed fire. When we look at the structure and EMS fire service, we see 1.2 million people nationally in this space, whether they're career, volunteer, paid for call service. So 1.2 million local people who have committed to some sort of level of fire response to their community. That doesn't mean they're all responding to wildfires. A lot of those people are potentially in Chicago or New York or Houston, not necessarily worried about a forest fire raging into their neighborhood. But then when we look at the next statistic within FEMA, we see that 62% of the fire departments that register their information with FEMA have said they respond to a wildfire. So 62% of our local fire departments and fire districts are dealing with this challenge. So when we look at some of these events that are happening in places like Texas or Western Massachusetts just had an 1,100 acre wildfire going right through a neighborhood, these aren't places that are going to be solved by Forest Service fixing their wildfire staffing issues. This is a much greater challenge that we have to identify and start working with. Not that we want to diminish the need to fix a lot of these things we're seeing with Forest Service wildland fire staffing issues, but that's not going to fix all of our problems. It's a lot more daunting than that. It's a lot more frightening than just saying we need to fix those federal challenges. So really thinking through that Wildfire Commission report, be comfortable diving into that and pulling those recommendations out and going to your chiefs, going to your city council, going to your county supervisors and saying, hey, these are things that we need to align with. Another big one, supporting beneficial wildfire. I mean, here in Arizona, giving the feds some kudos on that. It is really amazing the comfort level we have with the feds and with the state, pointing at you, that our state is doing this as well. Even the city, we had some city acres recently burned in a beneficial wildfire. These are really important tools in how we align the sense of urgency for our communities that we've created for how we respond to wildfires that are potentially undesirable, how we can use that same sense of urgency to respond and turn those wildfires into something desirable. Those are protecting our communities in really effective ways. And there's a vocal but limited group of folks out there who are saying that's not appropriate land management, and I disagree, and I think people in this room probably are more aligned with seeing the benefits of this. But that acre, that site doesn't really care what the policy is. If it's good fire, it's good fire. Whether it's under a suppression, a prescribed fire, a response, whatever it is, we know when we're getting good fire on the ground, and really focus on, in your community, what advantages you guys have to get that good fire on your ground and run with it and support it and advocate for it. And then in enabling research and organizations with a comprehensive community wildfire risk reduction mission. For example, like National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, is doing some amazing things. They're still a nonprofit, but when we look at, this time of year, people are making a lot of charitable gifts. They're looking at a lot of land management organizations or advocacy organizations. I doubt any of us are looking at National Fire Protection Association to make a donation in somebody's name. But they're doing really important things. And so as a community, our thought on how NGOs and nonprofits and advocacy groups can be empowered in this space, really look at some of that and think about those wildfire risk-based organizations that are doing comprehensive work, not just in the natural environment, but in both natural and built environments. And research. If I see another paper that tells me stand replacing crown fire and ponderosa pine is undesirable, I'm gonna go crazy. It's like, we know this, and so we're seeing some really cool transitional research these days looking at built environment. And we'll have some folks talking about that later today, but for example, fire pathways into the built environment. Usually you run your model of fire behavior in the forest, in your grassland, in the woodlands, wherever it is. As soon as you hit a neighborhood, that model stops and we're just guessing what's gonna happen. There's really smart folks working on making that model go through the neighborhood. So we're looking at these pathways of how is fire gonna make it through your community? Where are those pinch points that we should be focusing our limited resources into? Structure vulnerability models. We can basically now run some models through neighborhoods as if it's the forest and say, if we protect these 10 homes over here, that might reduce spread to the next 100 homes. So really thinking about fire spread, and like we've heard from other folks, don't just think of the forest as the fuel, think of the community as the fuel as well. So at the national scale, I think these are some changes that, again, we have these really daunting challenges in front of us, but there's action that we need to do, that framework exists for us to plug into. And then at the state level, we need to have some more framework around mitigations that matter. So I bet a bunch of us have stood in somebody's driveway and made recommendations to them on what that homeowner needs to do, what that HOA needs to do. We're not doing that in a framework that actually has legs where their insurance company or modelers or their city or whoever will go in there and say, you're right, that's what we want you to do. We know we're reducing their actual wildfire risk, but it's not agreed upon in some formal way in policy. And so working together as a state to start developing some of these strategies, to have these agreed upon mitigations that matter, is going to be really important moving forward. Liability definitions that enable more prescribed fire. We've been seeing this growing in some other states. We can't just burn Forest Service and state lands and solve these challenges. We need to be putting fire on private lands. We need to be burning people's 5-acre yards to reduce wildfire risk. We started doing a little bit of that in the city, but the reality is we need some improvements in statewide liability definitions to allow people to get insurance to do this work. We were running into that within the city of Flagstaff. We got a new risk manager and we were reviewing our burn plans, and she goes, I recently looked into trying to get prescribed fire insurance for the city and I couldn't get any. And it's like, well, if a city can't get it, how is a rancher gonna get it? How is an HOA gonna get it? Who's gonna create the enabling conditions to mitigate some of that risk and create those insurance policy options for us? And so looking at statewide prescribed burn associations, looking at a lot of things that we've had some lessons learned from other states. We're ready for that here in Arizona. I think we've got some good traction and some right folks in place to start working on that. And then locally, a lot of us work at that local level. We need community wildfire protection plans that matter. We can't just keep checking a box to say, well, we've got one and we renewed it 5 years ago because we had a meeting and we talked about it. We need live, updated CWPPs that are operating in our communities and giving guidance. Really thinking about the 5 E's of community risk reduction and aligning with those just like we do with the cohesive strategy. So education, engineering a smart built environment, enforcement of smart codes. Codes are going to be a big deal moving forward as we start expanding more into the WUI. And I know it's tough because we hear a lot of things like these rural areas, they don't want codes. There's no political will to go into a new development in very rural areas and say, you know what, you need to follow these new codes and build more fire-wise buildings. But those are the people who are at the highest risk. And what we're seeing right now is a lot of people who can do the risk reduction on their property are getting beat by rising insurance rates or losing coverage because everybody around them hasn't done that work either. So if we can start lifting everybody up instead of managing to the lowest common denominator, I think we'll be setting our communities up for a lot more success. Economic incentives too. That's another thing we've got to figure out. So somebody does and invests in the mitigation that matters work. What's the incentive to them? Because right now there really isn't one other than we know they're reducing wildfire risk. When that fire happens and it rips through the neighborhood, they're going to be at a lower chance of losing their home. But what about the models and the insurance rates that they're now dealing with? There's just not a lot of economic incentives for some of these folks doing that work other than the actual risk reduction, the perceived risk reduction. We're struggling to incentivize that. And then emergency response. Again, getting back to top-down training and equipment for wildland urban interface response and really getting folks to transition in the fire service. I look at the transition over the years of structure fire absorbing EMS service. And there was a time where I'm sure there was a lot of folks who were like, I do structure fire, I don't want to do EMS. Well, 90% of your calls are probably EMS and not structure fires. In the city of Flagstaff, we put out more wildfires than we do structure fires. So we've got to start that culture shift in the fire service to say, I do structure, I do EMS, and I do wildfire response. And that wildfire response may mean you're doing prescribed fire implementation. It's not just putting those fires out, it's managing fire, it's using fire. We protect our communities with fire, not necessarily from fire. And so this is one that we struggle with sometimes, I think, but when you're in that driveway, when you're in a public meeting, when you're someplace talking to your constituents, man, the best thing we can do is tell them the truth, and sometimes that means let's focus your community on evacuation and insurance. And because your neighborhood's $1 billion in the hole and what it's going to take to actually reduce the wildfire risk to your community, and we have no idea how to get our hands on that kind of money. So working through evacuation, I think that's something we all struggle with. It's something that happens and everybody just jumps and we're never prepared. And I think we can do a much better job with our communities in having that honest conversation about evacuation isn't just a little check sheet you stick in a drawer and you forget about and suddenly there's a red flag day and you start thinking about it. It needs to be more of a year-round practice for us. And then understanding your insurance coverage. I was on a webinar a while ago and there was a rep from an insurance industry there, and somebody from the audience asked a question, what should we do? And they basically were like, understand your coverage. If you don't understand your coverage, then you're behind the curve. And so I did a little work online to try to, chat GPT. I was like, what does it mean to understand your coverage? And because I don't understand my coverage as well as I should. This is something we all struggle with. And so this is what it came up with. Understand your policy. Review your policy to understand what's covered in the event of wildfire, and make sure you have adequate coverage for rebuilding costs. Rebuilding costs, I guarantee I don't have the right amount of coverage. It is expensive to rebuild anything right now in the state of Arizona. And so making sure that that number aligns with reality. Updating your coverage limits, adding endorsements or riders for additional protection, such as coverage for temporary living expenses or increased coverage limits. We really need to be taking this stuff seriously and not just, paying that monthly check and not thinking about this stuff. Documenting your property. Keep an up-to-date home inventory with videos or photos of your belongings. Store this information in a safe place. Don't just store it on your laptop that then burns down in the house fire. So really thinking about how we're talking to the public about this stuff. We can spend all day talking about home hardening and defensible space, but if you're in a community that's incredibly high fire risk and you've got 10 minutes to convince somebody to do something, is it better to talk about how they can go cut a few trees on their property, or to give them advice about how to be prepared when and if your house burns down? Reviewing deductibles. Shopping around, that's another big one. We see that in Flagstaff quite a bit. We're getting phone calls. Somebody says, my rates just tripled. What should I do? Shop around. We still are getting most people the opportunity to maintain their coverage, maintain their rates if they shop around. If one provider is just raising rates in Flagstaff because the risk is higher, there's probably some other folks who are willing to take your coverage that maybe aren't seeing the need to raise that rate so much. So really thinking about those things when you're talking to your constituents. We're in people's driveways, we're in their personal space having these conversations. Make sure we're doing it really effectively. So that's all I had. I really think, like I said, there's a lot of challenges, and people ask us these questions. Can you send me a picture of a fire adapted community? And I get online and I start looking, because there's not any that I can think of that look good enough to put a picture into a presentation. I can find a couple homes. I can find a lot more forest that we've done the thinning, that we've done the burning, that looks great, than I can find the neighborhood that looks great. Some of the neighborhoods that have been built since the city of Flagstaff adopted a WUI code look pretty good, but we're still dealing with some weird veg guidelines. Why are we leaving trees that rub up against your gutter? And so we're trying to fix all this. So lots of challenges ahead. It needs to come from bottom up and top down. And I think the success story that I just want to close out with is the example of the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. It's something that's been very successful for Forestry, the Forest Restoration Initiative in Flagstaff, across northern Arizona, over into Pine Top, over into New Mexico. That started because a bunch of people at the local level were saying, we're running into these bottlenecks, whether it's lawsuits or you're doing a NEPA that's 5,000 acres. I just had a 500,000 acre fire. What are you doing to prevent this effect? People at the local level wanted to break through these barriers, and they said, collaboration seems to be working. If we can get everybody in the room and collaborate and compromise and do this work together, we think it'll work. So that message starts feeding up through organizations into Washington, D.C. Lobbyists, policy advocates get together, Congress gets some action on it, and they create a pot of money, Collaborative Forest Restoration Program, Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. That Congress puts money into this pot, and now people at the local level can apply through a collaborative effort to get their hands on that money. That program, over the last 14 years, has given out over $500 million. That probably has been matched by close to $1 billion in other investments, whether it's municipalities, whether it's private sector industries that now have some more assurance on timber supply, just local partners facilitating this effort. So here we have a potential $1.5 billion comprehensive program that's been incredibly successful. We don't have that for the neighborhood, and we need that for the neighborhood. So we have these frameworks that exist on things we've done successfully in the natural environment. Everybody in this room, that's your job. Figure out how you, in your community, translate that success into the built environment for your community. Thank you.
Wow, so if your head is spinning like mine is after I hear Neil speak, don't worry, because we invited him to give that talk to lay the groundwork for what's happening the next few days. So most of those key points he made we're going to take deep dives into. So community wildfire protection plans, insurance, what does fire adapted communities look like? What does writing successful grant look like? All of these things covered in the next few days. Also, I wanted to mention that I'm giving our plenary speakers this map of the most significant wildfires of Arizona since we've been taking SCORE. And those maps include fires that we write up in an annual summary called the Wildfire Season Overview. And so we now have 10 years worth of wildfire season statistics available online. And this map also geo-referenced available at the Southwest Fire Science Consortium website. Just wanted to let you know that in case you're ever out in the field and you're like, there was a fire here once, what fire was it? Now you have a map you can put on your phone. So just plugging that. Also, I want to say that after our 3 keynote speakers, we're going to have them come up, and then there'll be time for Q&A. So if you had questions for Neil, just write it down. You'll have an opportunity to ask those here in a few minutes. Finally, I want to say that we are going to create a summary of this event. And so some of those key points that have been brought up, there'll be a reference guide, and Margie Brown is here. Raise your hand. Here's Margie, who may be asking you questions, taking photos, and she's responsible for writing the summary. So thank you, Margie. So last but not least, I want to introduce Tom Torres. He is the director of Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management, also known as the State Forester. Thank you, Tom.
All right, hey, good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. I'm really pleased with the number of people that are here today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of talk big picture. I'm going to talk about sort of what Neil was alluding to, what we're doing at the state level. I'm even going to go a little bit further back and talk about how we're aligned with what the feds are doing, because at the end of the day, you know, the framework that is put in place by the federal government has impacts to everything we do downstream, whether it's at the state level or county level, neighborhood level, city, et cetera. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the conditions of WUI in the state, just to sort of set a framework for where we're at as a state. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that I see as the state forester when it comes to WUI. And then finally, I'm going to end with talking about strategies for action. And a lot of them are going to be high level, but also going to talk about some of the work that we do at the state to help communities and organizations be successful. So let's talk about WUI conditions in Arizona. And so I have a couple of charts here that represent the change in the WUI conditions over the last, say, 30 years. The chart on the left shows the amount of WUI area that has existed since 1990 and exists in 2020. You know, 2020 is not that far away, so it could be considered to be contemporary or relevant. The chart on the right shows the number of housing units in those WUI areas in the state. And so if we just look at the chart to the left, it shows that since 1990, there has been some pretty significant growth in the amount of WUI area in terms of square kilometers. That's the value over on the right axis. And you know, one of the things I want to highlight is that the percent of change from 1990 to 2020 shows about a 50% increase in the WUI area in Arizona. And just to be clear, just to ground us, WUI is the area where human development and the undevelopment wildland meet. I think it's important to sort of stay grounded in that definition. Sometimes we throw around this word WUI, and it's like, what are we really talking about? But it's where people in development interact with the wildland communities of Arizona. And so it shows about a 50% increase in area. The chart on the right shows the number of housing units. And housing units is simply one of those values at risk that is present in the WUI. There's other values, but for all intents and purposes, WUI, the number of housing units is one of the things that we can really measure with a certain degree of accuracy. And so what it shows is that since 1990 to 2020, there's been a 124% increase in the number of housing units, i.e. people, that live in the WUI areas across the state. I don't expect you to read all this, but this is a summary of what that growth has looked like across the counties in Arizona. And so 15 counties in Arizona. Pinal County actually sort of leads the way in WUI growth in over the last 30 years. It shows a 223% increase, and essentially going from 40,000 housing units to about 128,000. And as the state forester, we're actively engaged in the firefighting fight, and there's a lot of unincorporated communities. There's a lot of state land in that county. We spend a lot of effort putting out wildfires in Pinal County as well as other counties. Since we're in Pima County, you might be interested to know that the amount of housing units has essentially doubled from 1990. There's about 275,000 housing units within Pima County as of 2020, and it's growing, right? I actually live here in the Tucson area. I've lived here for about 14 years, and I've seen the increase in the number of housing units, the amount of development that has increased over the 10 years or 14 years that I've been here. So since we're in Tucson, I thought I'd just show this map that shows the increase in those WUI conditions in the Tucson area. The map on the right represents those conditions in 1990. The map on the right shows what it looked like in 2020. And you'll notice that there's a lot more infill in development adjacent to the federal lands. The Saguaro National Park over to the west, and a little bit to the southeast, and the Coronado National Forest largely to the west and the north. You'll see that there's significant infill in Oro Valley, even if you look up towards Marana. But if you look at all that space adjacent to the Coronado National Forest, and that's wilderness area, so there's not a lot of active management in there. It's also where the Bighorn fire happened back in 2020. There's a lot of infill there. And so this is sort of indicating, at least for the Tucson area, that there's continued increase in that density that I was talking about, and we can probably expect that to increase in the future. By the way, the data that I'm showing here is from the Silvis lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and they've mapped the WUI conditions from across the world, and there's really good data for every county in the state of Arizona, every county in the country, as well as every state. We've done our own independent GIS analysis at DFFM, and we have that to support our efforts as well. So I'm going to sort of transition from what some of the WUI conditions look like in the state to talk about what some of the WUI challenges are that I see as the state forester. And I've been informed by a lot of conversations with our partners, a lot of the folks that are in this room. Obviously my boss, Governor Hobbs, has a big interest in the welfare of all Arizonans, and I'm going to talk a little bit about her vision as well for how we address WUI, wildland fire conditions, and such. So some of the conditions I see, or the challenges that I see, are one of the first ones is what I've alluded to previously: continued growth and development, and that means additional risk. It also means additional responsibility for those of us who have responsibility for initial attack, extended attack, etc., when smoke is in the air. The second challenge I see is, I just sort of alluded to it: increased wildland fire response and responsibilities of fire departments in fire districts. For those of you who are firefighters in here, you know what I'm talking about. And oftentimes, those increased responsibilities come with decreasing resources, revenue to fully meet the firefighting challenge. Number 3 is insurance. Neil did a good job of talking about what some of those insurance challenges are. Not only the affordability and availability of insurance policies for homeowners and commercial owners and stuff like that, but also the financial solvency of those private providers. I think in the commission report that Neil was talking about, it referenced over $50 billion in payouts from the insurance companies over the past X number of years. So, it's a two-way street. Not only do homeowners have a challenge getting insurance, but the insurance providers themselves are having trouble paying when there's a claim. Number 4, changing fire regimes. There's a great article at the Fire Consortium table out there that sort of synthesizes some of the science around the grassification of the Sonoran Desert. You all, well, some of us who live in the Sonoran Desert here in Tucson, but also going up towards Flagstaff, will be aware that there's a lot more grass in the Sonoran Desert that hasn't been there in the past. The Sonoran Desert is not a fire-adapted landscape, and as such, with all that invasive grass, fire regimes are changing. What that means is more active fire, more extreme fire, and more impacts to the WUI communities. Number 5 are those competing priorities for investments. We're here today and over the next few days to talk about WUI, but there are other competing priorities for the amount of energy, the amount of money, and the amount of effort that we put into wildfire. There's competing priorities for protecting our infrastructure along, especially the power lines that provide power to our large cities, Phoenix, Tucson, but also other parts of the state. There's the need for investment to protect our watersheds. Water is directly related to fire. Another competing priority are habitat and cultural resource values. So all these things have to be considered in the big picture when we're deciding where to spend our energy, effort, and money. Number 6 is climate change impacts. The bottom line is we have longer fire seasons. What's the temperature out there today? Almost 80 degrees? We have active fire conditions right now, and here we are in December. That's a change from previous years, and it's likely going to continue we're likely to be impacted by changing climate. Limited resources. I don't have to tell anybody in this room that our resources are limited, but we have been really fortunate to have had an influx of funding both at the federal level and at the state level. I'm going to talk about the state funding here more in a few minutes, but we have been in sort of unprecedented times over the past 3 or 4 years with the funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Nicole talked about those monies that came from the Forest Service for $5 million. That's a direct result of those increased resources and funding from the federal government. Number 8 is the community awareness and social acceptance. There's a gap in understanding what the real risks are in our communities. Neil did a really good job of sort of highlighting some of that stuff, but there's also some resistance to some of those proactive mitigation measures, such as vegetation removal where it's necessary, prescribed fire, and managed wildfire. And that needs to be addressed as well. Number 9 is the interagency and stakeholder coordination. This is a complicated space that we work in. This map sort of represents that complicated nature of our business. This map shows the different land ownership and management responsibilities across the state of Arizona. Each one has their own different priorities, their own boss, their own budget, and it's sort of complicated at times when we talk about how we need to be coordinated given all the different changes or all the different responsibilities of the different land management agencies. Just as a sort of a quick summary, it's about 73 million acres of of land in the state. About 22 million acres of that are the responsibility for fire suppression at DFFM. There's about 9 million acres of state trust land, which DFFM has direct responsibility for both land management activities and wildfire suppression, and then about 22 million acres of unincorporated private, which we combat wildfire with our cooperators and our partners. But in Arizona, it's really sort of interesting that of all that land, there's only about 18% that are privately owned, and therefore the need for a lot of collaboration with the federal partners, the tribal partners, and counties and others. Wildfire risk. I just wanted to show this map to show, everybody has a model, right? And you know what they say about models? They're all wrong, but some of them are useful. I think this one's sort of useful. This is our Arizona RAP model that we have on our website that sort of represents wildfire risk at sort of a larger scale. And a few things to notice on this map. Number one, you'll see a lot of red and yellow around a lot of the WUI areas that we're going to be talking about. There's also a lot of risk in the federal estate. If you think about the map that I just showed previously, a lot of that red and green is on the national forest system, and therefore the need for a lot of collaboration, coordination, etc. I wouldn't be the state fire. They also call me the state fire director sometimes, as well as the state forester. And I wouldn't be the state fire director unless I showed a little bit of information about recent statewide fire activity. Back in 2019 was a really big year. Was that 2020? 2020 was a really big year in Arizona in terms of numbers of acres burned. And in 2021, which was the year of the Bighorn Fire, 20 was Bighorn Fire and some others, the bush fire up north of Phoenix. 2021 was the Telegraph Fire. And I sort of show this slide to highlight a couple of things. The number of acres is highly variable on a year-to-year basis, but the number of fires that we actually have is around 2,000 acres, or 2,000 fire starts a year that are actively managed for initial attack or extended attack. And so the point is that I want to make here is that even though in 2024, which is not on there because we're compiling the information now at the end of the calendar year, was sort of about, 250,000 acres, about 2,500 starts. But you don't have to have a big fire season to have a lot of impact. One of the most impactful fires we had this past summer was the Watch Fire on the San Carlos Apache, in the community of San Carlos, which is on the reservation. They lost over 20 homes, and that fire was only about 2,000 acres. And so you don't have to have big fires to have a lot of impact. You think about Lahaina that happened back in 23 in Hawaii. That fire was not very big either, but it was the worst, most costly wildfire incident in the history of the United States. It burned about 2,700 acres, but it burned thousands of pieces of property. One of the interesting things I'll just mention about Lahaina, after Lahaina happened, I went to the islands. I went to the Big Island to talk about some of the wildfire risk down there. And it was largely an invasive species issue that carried that wildfire. And when I was on the Big Island, I was out looking at some of the conditions, and I got to tell you, it did not look a lot different than what we have in southern Arizona. Really interesting. So I want to talk about big picture. When I was putting my slides together and thinking about this, I had this continuing thought about deja vu. We've been here before. There's been a lot of work put into this challenge that we have around wildfire, not only related to WUI, but across the larger landscapes. And so, Neil made mention of the cohesive strategy. And I just want to be a little bit clear on what the cohesive strategy is, because it has direct impact on the work I do and the work that you do at the end of the day. And so the cohesive strategy, back in 2009, Congress passed a law. It's called the Flame Act. And from that Flame Act, they said they wanted to establish they directed the Department of Interior and the USDA to develop a national cohesive strategy to comprehensively address wildland fire management across all lands in the United States. And there was three goals that came out of that. Neil mentioned them, but I want to provide a little bit more detail on them. Resilient landscapes, fire-adapted communities, safe and effective risk-based wildfire response. At the end of the day, the resources, the way that people think about the work that needs to happen is couched in those three goals to this day. And one of the things the cohesive strategy emphasized, among other things, are community wildfire protection plans. Neil made mention of those. They're important, but they're only important when they're actionable and we can inform where work needs to be done on the ground. So anyway, the cohesive strategy was published in 2014, and to this day, it still represents the foundation for how big programs are considered, conceived, and legislation is considered at the federal level. From that, Neil made mention of the commission, and we are really fortunate here in Arizona to have had Neil serve on that commission and provide his leadership on that. One of the things I just wanted to highlight from that commission report is a commitment to the cohesive strategy. This is a quote from the actual commission report. It says, throughout the discussions, the commission found the consistency and durability provided by the cohesive strategy. And so, again, I just mentioned this fact because at the end of the day, this is how leaders back in DC, this is how I think about it at the state, this is how I talk about it with the governor and the legislature, and it's important for you all to be aware that the cohesive strategy, the recommendations from the commission report are going to play an important role in how we move forward in the future. So what I have next on the next slide is sort of my top 10. Well, not my top 10. These are some of the actions that DFFM is taking at the state level to address WUI and other wildland fire conditions. Number one, increased capacity building and investments via our Healthy Forest Initiative. You know, I'm happy to say that DFFM as an agency of the state government has largely been supported both by the governor, who's a big supporter of the work we do, and the legislature. I don't have to tell you that we work in divided government, but the work that we do to fight fire and to support the different programs under the forestry program generally have broad support, and it's reflected in our budget. You know, last year, if you all were reading the newspapers, there were some pretty significant budget cuts at the state level. Largely, DFFM was spared from that, and that represents that support. You support what you pay for, and I'm happy to say that that support is continuing. Fingers crossed, knock on wood. Number two is the increased attention to our prevention program. My prevention chief, Aaron Kassem, is in the back of the room there, and we have a very robust prevention program, and we largely, well, part of that program, not all of it, is the NFPA Firewise Education Program. I'm happy to say that I think at this, Aaron's always giving me updated numbers. I think the last time I talked to him a few days ago, the state of Arizona had about 180 certified Firewise communities. That's second only in the nation to California. So that's pretty impressive, and that's a testament to the work from Aaron and his team. 187. All right, thank you, Aaron. They grow by the day. Number three is the fire code rulemaking. One of the things I want to share with you all today is that the state fire marshal works under my leadership at DFFM, and in 2025 we are going to be going through a fire code rulemaking exercise in which we are going to adopt the 2024 International Fire Code. The key point there that I want to highlight is that it's likely going to include the WUI code as an appendix. And that'll give, number one, it's sort of leader's intent from myself and the governor that the WUI code can be an important component for communities, jurisdictions in the future, but it also gives the ability to adopt it and modify it because it's an appendix. There's more details around that. But number four, increased strategic goal for wildfire mitigation. You know, one of the things there, it says 40,000 acres by 2026. Governor Hobbs has asked us to increase our efforts across the state of Arizona to reduce wildfire risk. And our goal is to get to 40,000 acres treated by 2026. We're in 2025 right now. Our goal is to treat 30,000 acres. Last year in 24, we treated about 20,000. So getting from 20 to 40 in 2 years is a big lift, but I think we can do it. Number five, increased coordination with the Forest Service, corporate and quasi-government organizations like SRP. I'm not going to dive into that because John Richardson, my assistant, is here. He's going to talk a little bit about that later in the day. Increased support of private industry via state contracting. At the end of the day, if we're really going to make a difference at pace and scale. We need to have private industry, machinery in the woods when we need to remove or modify vegetation and or construct fuel breaks. Number 7 is support to local fire districts. There's $10 million for fire apparatus grants. Last year, as my partners from the local districts know, we had a $5 million grant program to fund fire equipment. We're going to do the same thing this year with a different kind of federal funding, and the notice of financial opportunity will be coming out next week, I believe. Increased support, investments in community wildfire protection plans. We are committed to increasing the ability for local jurisdictions to understand where their risk is. And number 9 is wild insurance reform. I think Lori Munn from DIFI is here to give a little bit of talk more about what some of those details are, but DFFM is at the table with helping to understand how we improve insurance conditions in the state of Arizona. And number 10, increased engagement with partners and stakeholders. And that's what today's about, what the next couple of days are about. You know, I told John Richardson, my assistant, I said, I want to see as many of our staff here today in order to engage with you all. You'll see a lot of folks from my team here, so I think they got the memo. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. All right, I'm getting the signal that my time's coming to an end, but I never want to end a discussion when I talk about this kind of stuff without acknowledging our partners, both on the fire side and the forestry side. This slide just shows some of the partners that we work with on the firefighting side. It includes the Arizona Fire District Association, the Fire Chiefs Association, all the feds, the BIA and the tribal interests that they represent, DEMA, DEMA, FEMA, and all those folks. It's a team game, not only in fire, but also in forestry. And so I just want to thank you all, partners, for helping us all work together to make a difference. And finally, I'm going to end with this quote from President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower said back in the 60s, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. You know, I don't know, well, you all know this. Back in World War II, Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander for planning D-Day. It was the biggest, most comprehensive military operation in the history of military operations. It included the landing of over 160,000 troops, coordinated actions of over 18,000 ships and aircraft. Eisenhower was the person who led that and managed the planning and implementation of that. Obviously very successful. And you know, when he was president, somebody asked him, what was the biggest point of that? And he said this. He said, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. You know, we talk a lot about plans, CWPPs. Nicole shared her action plan for the city of Tucson. At the end of the day, those plans are useful, but they're just a start. And you know, the key point here is that planning as a verb, as an action, is the main point. And I think that's what we're here today to do, and tomorrow and a little bit of the next day, is to talk about that planning as the action and the verb. And I'm really happy you all are here to engage in that. And with that, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for laying the groundwork for us about the WUI and what the state is doing. So I'll have Nicole and Neil and Tom come back up so that you all can ask them some questions. We're going to have until about 11:45. We have 2 mics in the audience, so you can just raise your hand, wait for the mic, stand up, and then ask the question. So if you have a question for Neil or Tom or Nicole, you can just raise your hand. We'll run a mic to you. Here's your gift.
Oh, thank you.
Right here.
Hi, Jeff Amthor. I work with Verisk. I'm here in Oro Valley. I wanted to say one thing about the local fire services. If you don't know this, you mentioned EMS. I want to say in my neighborhood, it's relocating rattlesnakes is the thing that they do most often, not putting out fires, fortunately. So that's a complete aside. You know, I do have a question though. My wife is here in the Tucson area and works with a volunteer group that removes buffalo grass in Catalina State Park. They're all doing it on their own dime. And because I'm ignorant, I want to know what sort of local, county level, or state level actions could be taken to get, because there's a bunch of people that are volunteering, and I think there's a bunch of people that could. What can we do about actually engaging more of the public that wants to do things like removing invasive species? If you know what I'm talking about. I mean, what can we do about that? Because I don't see it, maybe I'm ignorant, I don't see the state and feds doing a lot of action there in terms of removing invasives. And I'm concerned not just about the structural fires that can result in the WUI, but also the saguaro are at some danger as well. So what can we do about maybe getting these groups larger, maybe actually getting them some support? That's it. And also I wanted to say, rattlesnake relocation is a really big deal in my neighborhood, and I really love all the fire guys there because they're so good at it.
So I'll talk about that from the state level. And so, you know, invasive species, buffalo grass down here in the south, other species up in the north like red brome, they are a significant problem. And so I think there's a lot more work to do to get coordinated around that. There are a number of different organizations that are engaged in that work. I know up near the Phoenix area, there's the Save the Saguaros campaign that are trying to actively restore some of those impacted Sonoran landscapes. During the not the bushfire, the telegraph fire, there was an estimated 80,000 saguaros that were lost. And so there's a lot of work that's being done at the sort of at the volunteer level. And you know, you mentioned your wife was part of one of those organizations. I know that the feds, I know Saguaro National Park is engaged in dealing with this buffalo grass within the park boundaries itself. So, you know, I know at DFFM we provide grants to communities and groups that are addressing the invasive species, but quite frankly, it's a big issue. And there's, I mentioned some of the synthesized science that's in the report out on the table by the Southwest Fire Consortium, and they provide some management guidelines or management recommendations for how we deal with it in the future, and it involves greater coordination. And so that work is ongoing, and so a lot more to come on that, and it's obviously a big issue in the state, in various parts of the state. Nicole, I don't know if you want to talk about it from Tucson level?
I know that there are some other speakers later in the couple of days who are going to address this too. So I think it's an ongoing conversation. Locally, we have a working group who's tackling it, but I agree that it requires a much larger scale of support.
Just kind of repeating again, invasive grasses, you know, that's a fast-moving grass fire that we can pretty aggressively deal with home hardening and defensible space. So it's again, it's a challenge, and it's a growing challenge. I mean, coming down, and everybody loves to get that resource order for the fire on the Tonto in the middle of June, right? And you see that grass cover coming in everywhere. It's a huge problem, but really effective defensible space and home hardening strategies at dealing with that fast-moving grass fire.
I'll just plug a couple things. We're going to have a workshop that's going to look at how to develop mitigation strategies for homeowners who live in the Sonoran Desert, because all of the recommendations come from forested areas and people don't know what to do. And so it is our responsibility to put together these recommendations. That's what we're going to do later on this week. So sit in that workshop if you're interested in that. The other thing is, next year we're going to be putting together a summit on invasive species in the Sonoran Desert. So that's another probably one-day event going to be held out at the Sonoran Desert Museum. So, you know, pay attention to our newsletter if you want to attend that event. Okay, other questions?
Hi, Emily Troisi with Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. Nicole, quick question for you. The $5 million grant you mentioned, I was curious if that was the Urban Community Forestry grant through Bill and IRA?
Yeah, that's the IRA funding.
Awesome, thank you. And then Neil and Tom, you both mentioned actionable CWPPs, and I'm talking about CWPPs later today, so I'm curious from both of your perspectives, what does that look like to you to find an actionable CWPP? Thanks.
Well, I would let the community define what actionable means in the space that we're working in, more than some of the agency reps doing that. But what I really think is just focusing your outcomes on actions that we can take, and having a few of those kind of moonshot ideas in there. But I mean, really making sure that we're creating those documents to almost mirror like a 5-year plan. So it's not just a list of, these are the big scary challenges in the room, but here are the things over the next 5 years we're going to do to go after them. And then in 5 years, you're not just reviewing and opening the door back to your CWPP to check a box to say it's current. You're actually going in and checking and saying, how many of these things have we accomplished, and we can take off the list and add some new ones. So really making sure that they're a living document is something I think we want to do a better job with.
I think from my perspective, one of the things that makes a CWPP successful is that it's integrated with some of the other plans from the other agencies. I showed the map that showed all the different land management agencies. And so, a CWPP should incorporate or be aware of the different goals, activities, projects from the adjacent landowners, because it's, fire doesn't respect boundaries, CWPP shouldn't either. The other thing that I consider to be successful in the future is a way to track it geographically on GIS systems, because there's a lot of people working in this space right now in Arizona, and just keeping track of where people are working, whether it's a federal land management agency, whether it's a state, whether it's an NGO like the Nature Conservancy or the National Forest Foundation, that's a challenge. One of the things I didn't mention in my talk is that Governor Hobbs just signed a shared stewardship agreement with the USDA undersecretary for the state to coordinate that data sharing with the U.S. Forest Service, and we will sort of use that as a platform to invite others to share their work as well. So, being aware of all the different projects so we can get sort of a synergistic approach to the work and the limited resources that we have is important.
Good morning, Neil, Tom. Loved your topics this morning. As you know, I think a lot of times we forget about the historical wildfire conditions here in Arizona dating back to the rodeo Chetasky. And it seems like, again, we're deja vu. And it almost seems like there's an escalating tension in the room. I think you're going to talk about some statistics that Frank's going to talk about, vapor density as an example, and what catastrophic wildfire is going to look like in the future. I say that because insurance is the biggest problem, and Neil knows this in the Flagstaff area. We're seeing this escalate to proportions that I can't even imagine right now. My personal story, just looked at my mortgage payment and couldn't understand why it went up by over $1,000 a month. It's the impounds, it's insurance. My insurance is more than the actual principal mortgage payment. The common individual is not going to be able to afford this. One of our apartment complexes just lost insurance coverage. The financing will not cover property transactions now, and people only can purchase in this particular complex with cash. We're hurting from an insurance perspective. So I think there's an urgency here to identify those solutions, like the insurance industry implementing a WUI ISO, if you will, but not telling us how to manage those benchmarks to demonstrate what community. Aaron just mentioned this as an example. 2014, 65 FireWise USA communities. Today we have 187. There's work being done on the ground that should make a difference to property owners' premiums. It's not being recognized. Thoughts?
Vapor pressure deficit is real. We were talking about that at the table earlier. Just a thought on that for the room. What we envision as a catastrophic wildfire today is probably more desirable than that same fire happening 20 years from now. So what's our definition of undesirable wildfire? I think we need to get really uncomfortable with that and think about are we suppressing this fire because we might have 50% high severity, or are we going to let it burn and say 50% high severity is fine even though we're not hitting any values at risk? Because in 20 years, that same fire might be 100% high severity. So vapor pressure deficit, when you hear people talking about that, pay attention. You're right about the challenges with the insurance work. I think I like to frame some of our conversations around we need to better reduce the wildfire risk to our communities and do it in a way that informs the issues that we're seeing with the insurance models and rates issues. The goal isn't to fix insurance problems. It's to reduce the wildfire risk in a way that fixes the insurance problems. And so what I think one of our solutions is the data. I mean, we don't have parcel level data at a scale that matters. We have some of these Firewise communities that have done good work, but nobody's feeding that up into a data set that actually represents that good work. So how we go about collecting this data, we've got Fireside in the room. That's exactly their business model, is creating opportunities on how we collect that data and use it in impactful ways beyond just telling a homeowner, you've reduced your risk. Well, then we start building up the neighborhood and say, well, now we've got a whole neighborhood of people that have reduced their risk. And now we're actually collecting data at a scale that can potentially steer that wildfire risk model. And so I think it's going to probably get worse before it gets better. It's going to be a while before we get some policy in place that allows those insurance companies to recognize the models that are hopefully being informed by the data that we're collecting on the ground. But it's going to take something a lot more robust than Firewise USA. It's going to take something really aggressive in how we look at retrofitting existing neighborhoods, how we look at creating new neighborhoods. So again, huge challenge, but the science and the frameworks are there for us to plug into our systems here in Arizona. And I think, we've got Tom on board, we've got the State Office of Insurance on board, we've got the right people in the room. We just need some time to hopefully create some smart policy and not knee-jerk reaction-based policy, and take some of the lessons learned on what hasn't worked in other places, what has worked in other places. I mean, we hear a lot of things about we need a state fair plan in here in Arizona. It's similar to California, insurance of last resort. And I get a little worried about that. How does a fair plan reduce wildfire risk? It sometimes, if it's not done well, it incentivizes risky development. It incentivizes people to not do the mitigations that matter. So I think we've got some really good lessons learned out there on how to create policy that isn't designed, again, with the end state being fix the insurance problem. Create policy with the end state of we're going to reduce wildfire risk in a way that informs the insurance problem.
Yeah, just to build on that a little bit, when we talk about effective policy, it needs to have the insurance underwriters at the table. And so one of the things that this new resilient and mitigation insurance council that's going to be convened next week, by the way, at the state level. Lori Munn's in the office, in the room, and she's going to talk a little bit about that more here shortly. But we need to have insurance at the table. One of the things that we should be cognizant of is that we want to make sure that whatever policies are adopted by the legislature or counties or whatever are going to have an effect, the effect that's desirable, not only to make insurance affordable and available, but also that puts the insurance companies in a position where they can be successful as well. Because if they're not successful, nobody's successful. There's frameworks in other states that are underwritten by the state. I'm not so sure that's the best way to go because there are challenges there. So, Chief, I appreciate the conversation. I get this question every time I speak, and I'm happy to say that if we get the right people at the table, have those probably uncomfortable conversations and real conversations, we can come up with some recommendations that can actually make a difference. I'm hopeful.
Okay, well, this is going to conclude our session this morning. So thank you, Nicole and Tom and Neil. Round of applause for them.